Welcome to Crossroads and Cauldrons. We are two witches with jobs, families, and busy lives just like you. We talk about weaving the web of community, practicing magic, and life in the Deep South. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. I'm Selena, and you're listening to Crossroads and Cauldrons podcast. I'm so excited about the guest that we have today. His name is Keldon Mercury. If you're not familiar with him, he is a practicing traditional witch for over a decade. He's the author of, his most recent book is The Witch's Sabbath, an exploration of history, folklore, and modern practice. He also wrote The Crooked Path, which you might be familiar with, an introduction to traditional witchcraft. That came out a couple of years back. But his writing has appeared in The Witch's Altar, The New Aradia. He has a Patheos blog as well, which you're probably familiar with, called By Athame and Stang. And I'm so delighted to have him on the show. Welcome, Keldon, to the Crossroads. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Yay. So, I love this book. First of all, and I say this almost every Llewellyn book I pick up, it's gorgeous. Whoever's in charge of their art department, give them a raise. This is beautiful. It's beautiful. Tell us a little bit. Okay. Hi, I'm just jumping right in. I'm sorry about that. So I love how this book, it sort of merges so much of the historic and folkloric accounts from the witch trials and things like that about the witch's Sabbath. And I have not seen that sort of compiled in one place and also merged with how it can be used in modern practices on this deep of a level before. So, and for it to be such a small book, that means that you did very well and were concise. But what inspired you to write this book in this particular way?
Mm-hmm. So really the first and foremost, the biggest inspiration in writing this book is just my love for the Witch's Sabbath. It's a huge part of my personal practice. It's also a giant love letter to my adoration for folklore and history. I'm a huge nerd, essentially. And one thing that I've noticed in just my time reading books and researching witchcraft is that there's not a lot written for modern practitioners regarding the Witch's Sabbath, and specifically the Witch's Sabbath as this otherworldly gathering of witches and spirits. We have plenty of writing about the Sabbaths, or the Wheel of Year, but there's not a lot written about kind of where that concept comes from itself and how it's rooted in this older folklore, and it's folklore that's still being utilized by certain modern practitioners today. So I really wanted to bring this information to our community. One thing I always mention is that a lot of the writing that's been done about the Witch's Sabbath is in the realm of academics. It's going to be found in academic texts written by historians and folklorists, and those books are often not super accessible to everyone. And the other thing too is that those scholars, I'm going to assume here, a lot of them are not modern practitioners of witchcraft, and so their scholarship, their study sort of has a stopping point, but it's not where the Sabbath actually stops. It keeps going, and it's found new ways of being within modern practice, and that's worth exploring as well. So that's really the crux of how this book came about.
I really like the this book. I know that you're saying that you're taking texts from academics and from historians, and well noted that they're not coming from they don't practice these practices. So they're looking at this as, mythology or, things that are not real or really experienced in any sort of way. So, and you're taking that to a more accessible approach, which I agree. But I also think that the way that you've written this particular book, and I would apply that to The Crooked Path as well, though not quite on the same level, it has a more academic approach than what you see a lot today, which I really appreciate, because that's how I learn. I learn better that way. I'm a huge history person myself, so this was absolutely wonderful and rich to read. And I think a lot of publishers today, and maybe it's the publishers and maybe it's just what's in demand, I don't know, but a lot of publishers sort of don't want that. They want the surface. They want it to be approachable and accessible for everyone, which is great. However, there has to be a point where, okay, now that we've approached everyone, where do we go next? How do we take that more deeper, And I like that about this book, because it is a deeper exploration of these practices. What are your thoughts about that? Because accessibility is important, but not everyone is ready for particular information, and that's fine, because you have to dig for things. So talk to me about that a little bit. Was Llewellyn open to the depth of the book, or was there sort of a negotiations with as far as that went?
No, I mean, they were very open. And I think that there's, it's interesting, because accessibility and practicality don't necessarily equate to like dumbed down.
Right.
And one of the things that I am particularly not a fan of, especially, and you find this a lot in sort of traditional witchcraft spheres, is very ornate, flowery language, to put it nicely. It's like, how can we take this concept and how can we ensconce it in so much word salad that, we went from like something we could have said in like 5 sentences and made it 2 chapters. I don't think that there's necessarily a need for that. So my goal in writing is always to just get to the heart of the material. I think that you can provide depth and mystery and all of that, and still have it be readable and practical. And that's very much how I feel too in terms of like scholarship, is that, how can we take some of these things that could be written in sort of very dry ways, and how can we bring it alive? How can we tell these stories to people in a way that's engaging?
No, I really think you've done a great job of that. I also think that sort of presuming, and I'm not saying that not in this situation, but in other books that I've read, sort of presuming that your audience can't understand it is not the way to go. You know what I mean? It's like there's a focus on the form over the function. Like, what are you trying to achieve? And are you reaching that goal? Are you taking people's practices more deeply, or are you sort of just confirming what they already know? Or just, putting a new beautiful cover on it. So this was a very different approach to this particular topic, and I absolutely loved it. I loved it. So one of the things that you talk about at the very beginning of the book is sort of the process of scapegoating, and how it has been applied to a variety of different groups over the course of time. And I'm wondering, why do we do that? Like, where do you think that sort of comes from? Because the first times that we have written accounts of it, was in the, Roman Empire type era. But surely it goes back, because it has been so pervasive. Do you see this appearing in other cultures, like in the Americas or in Asian cultures as well? Or is it something strictly that has been spread from that, sort of Roman Empire route? Because they did spread into all these areas.
I think it's everywhere. I think it's probably existed since, I mean, the dawn of time, and it continues to this day because I think what it is it's a really um, human thing to do. And I'm sure like you could even make arguments that some of this like stems from like evolutionary psychology. But it's the us versus them mentality. It's that, there's this other group, these others, and they're
Mhm.
scary and threatening because we don't really know what it is that they're doing or what they
Mhm.
want. And so we start to make up stories. And sometimes this is done very intentionally in order to dehumanize people, to sort of turn them into monsters, because then it makes it easier to not care about those people, to hurt those people. Um, I mean, an unfortunate this is an unfortunate phenomenon that happens, and I think it's something that even today we have to sort of work on as people. Is like, when are we sort of vilifying maybe the other? So whether that's people who have different beliefs than us or who we don't agree with, do we sort of turn them into these caricatures so that, then we don't have to care about them so much as people? So I think this is something that's probably been going on forever, and it continues. I mean, it plays a big part in the development of the Witches' Sabbath. But one thing that's interesting too is like when we look at these sort of three kind of base accusations that follow through, that we find being lodged against different groups over time. So specifically, infanticide, cannibalism, and incestuous orgies. Is, I mean, we still find those accusations popping up in sort of like today's conspiracy theories being lodged against different people. So um,
That's
it's
what
certainly,
interested me the most. Like
yeah.
the whole the concept of scapegoating, like I can understand that because if you whatever you don't understand, you're going to feel threatened by. And if
Hmm.
you feel threatened by someone else's perceived power in your mind,
Hmm.
you're going to try to dehumanize them so that if they're not human, then you are justified in whatever
Right.
heinous acts you
Hmm.
commit against them, right?
Hmm.
But the fact that it was these sort of three specific charges that came up over and over. I mean, it could have been anything, but why
Hmm.
these three? And they're still happening today. Like,
Right.
you see this stuff in like QAnon bullshit.
Hmm.
Like, it's the
Hmm.
same stuff. And it's
Hmm.
remarkable that humans just don't seem to learn as a group. Um, but it's interesting how it always comes back to these are witches,
Hmm.
some framework of they get thrown in as witches, as working with evil spirits, as that's the root of it. They're not just cannibals, they're not just killing babies, they're not just
Hmm.
incestuous. It's because of some evil spiritual entity that they have communed with in some sort of way, so
Hmm.
inevitably it becomes a witch, no matter what they
Right.
really were or what they were even doing, if anything at all.
Hmm.
And I find that fascinating. What are your thoughts about like the roots of it? Like why are we so afraid of what's across the veil? You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Yeah. I mean, it's this very basic human fear of the unknown, of, right, what is happening in the dark of night, what's happening behind those closed doors. um, we want to know. It makes us uncomfortable when we don't know, when we feel like there's a lack of control. And I think especially when we look at um, just like the way the world used to be in ye old days, people were really at the mercy of a lot more things than we are today. Even just even thinking about times where, like, before electricity, when like your only source of light would have been candles or fire or just the sun. So when the sun goes down, like, that's it. Now you're just in darkness. Is that there's a huge feeling maybe of powerlessness. And so you wonder, like, what is out there? Um, and two, sort of the other side of scapegoating, I mean, beyond just like dehumanizing your enemies, is that it gives you someone to blame. I mean, that's what scapegoating is. It's, my misfortunes, the things that are going wrong in my life. It's easier for me to put that on someone else than it is to accept my own responsibility in the situation, or to grapple with the fact that like bad things just happen sometimes, and especially in a time when we didn't necessarily have things like medical science or whatnot. We're really looking for an explanation for why these bad things are happening. And so turning towards this like spooky other, this, these sort of creatures of the night, if you will. I mean, that's a great place to put the blame.
I really like what you were saying about sort of fear of the unknown, fear of the dark and I think in modern era, because this is still happening, we still have, we've kind of created our own darkness. We've created our own blinders. And, it's sort of a lack of education, lack of experience, that we've put ourselves in the situations where we have an opportunity to learn and to sort of illuminate those areas, but we adamantly don't, because that's scary to step into those spaces, especially when we're told that those are evil, dark spaces.
Right.
So that's really, and that gives me some things to think about. It's interesting too, as because of everything we just said, modern practitioners now we and I don't know that, I'm not going to say that it wasn't happening before. I just don't think there's any, legitimate proof, but
right.
We're deliberately stepping into those spaces. We're saying, I'm going to go to the Sabbath and I'm going to see what I can see there. And I'm going to experience what I can experience there. And I think to me, that's sort of the essence of what witchcraft is. If you could possibly, I don't think it's definable, but I think that's the essence of it is, I want to see what's behind this closed door. I want to see what I don't know. I want to step into those places and look around, and to me, that's what witchcraft is. And that's why it expresses itself in so many different ways. Cause we're all coming into that space from a different direction. And the other worlds are so vast, which is kind of beautiful because we can explore together and share together and not be threatened by each other if we remember that. However, so we've kind of gone off on a rabbit trail. We haven't even mentioned, like, where are we even talking about? My poor listeners are like, huh? So let's talk about what is the Witch's Sabbath is the name of the book. This is a specific thing. This is not the Sabbath's the Wheel of the Year per se. Mm-hmm. So tell us about what is the Sabbath, and then maybe people understand what the hell we're talking about.
Yeah, so classically within folklore, and preceding or coming before the witch trials, and then going into the witch trials, the witch's Sabbath is this notion that during the nighttime hours, groups of witches gather together to pay homage to the devil. But they do a lot of things. They work magic, they celebrate, so they dance and they feast and they have sex, and all of these things happen. It's really quite fascinating and awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same time. But there's all of these stories that come about regarding this, and it's sort of debated a lot by different, and I say this with air quotes, learned authorities at the time, who were like trying to grapple with like, what is this? What's happening? And they're sort of debating the reality of this. Is this something that's happening in person? Is this something that happens in spirit? And so from a modern perspective, in modern craft, we work with this concept as a otherworldly gathering. So while we can enact this in physical space with other witches, really primarily it's something that is happening in the other world. You travel there in spirit, you engage in spirit form, and you participate in these different, these different acts. So whether that is working with particular spirits, making pacts, working magic together, maybe you are engaging in some of those more those acts of revelry. So you're dancing, but you're going and you're participating in this folkloric happening, and through that you gain empowerment and sometimes even these deeper pieces of gnosis, if you will.
So in the book in particular, and in my own experience as well, there tend to be particular characters that are frequently there when you arrive at the Sabbath. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I think that they can appear in different ways depending on the person who's experiencing it and their own,
Hmm.
psychic perceptions, how they perceive things once they get over there, and their own cultural filters. But we see similar functions, similar, I'm not going to say archetypes, but I'll say like archetypal beings, because
Hmm.
I don't think these are just like internal ideas. I think they're literal consciousness spirits out there. But the way we perceive them appears differently because we're different. But they all have similar threads, which I think is fascinating that you see this across so many different cultures. Can you speak to some of the things that you see, the different types of spirits that you can meet or commune with or experience at the Witches' Sabbath?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, classically within the folklore, the primary spirits that are going to be at the Sabbath, or the Sabbath, it's going to be the witches and the devil. Sometimes you'll find mentions of other like familiar spirits being present, but it's a little bit more close knit, if you will, for lack of better words, in the folklore. Today, I think there's way more variety. So if you go there, typically there is some sort of leader who's presiding over the Sabbath. So who this is going to depend on sort of the spirits that you work with. So this could be the devil. This could be the witch father. It could be Hecate. It could be whatever. If you work with the deity, this might very well be them. Um, you're also going to find ancestral spirits, so ghosts of the dead. These might be people that are your specific ancestors. They might be other ancestors. Um, you're going to find the fair folk are often present. Familiar spirits are often present. So you're really just going to find a whole host. And again, really, I mean, the crux of it is that it depends on the spirits that you work with. Those are going to be the spirits that show up. So, for example, like if you are a witch who does not work with the devil, then the devil's probably not going to show up to a Sabbath that you attend. It's going to be the spirits that you know that you already work with, and then sort of the spirits within the spheres that you would be operating in.
I think that's it's interesting that you mentioned that, because it can be so easily perceived as you're just making this up because all you ever see are the deities you work with. But I really think that that's that point where cosmologically the witches' Sabbath exists is between all the worlds. It's sort of that, it is that
Mhm.
liminal space. So I'm going to say spirits, meaning all types of different spirits, including human spirits. Humans, and I just said humans, spirits can all sort of reach this place and converge there in a variety of ways. So just because what you're seeing is spirits that you're in tune with, that doesn't mean there aren't other things there that you just are not perceiving because you are sort of aligned with this particular frequency, and that's how you're perceiving it. It's like the same TV but a slightly different channel. You know what I mean?
Right.
Maybe I'm being crazy. That could be true. But I think that's really fascinating because there, in my own experiences, I have been at the Sabbath, and I do call it Sabbath, but we're talking about the Sabbath. And I do generally perceive more of the, who I consider to be sort of the axis mundi as leading the Sabbath or the central pillar. But I've seen even like angels and different types of things. But I've often met spirits that I did not know, that I was not familiar with or did not expect or was afraid of for whatever reason, that appeared in that space. And I had the opportunity. Do I approach this? Do I initiate a relationship? Do I confront my own prejudices about this type of spirit? Or do I not, which is completely an option as well. But I have been there and found all sorts of things that I did not expect and did not previously work with as well. I want to hear some of your personal experiences at the Sabbath, because the book is this is for everybody. This is the types of things, which is wonderful. But how does it express to you personally? What are some of your experiences? Whatever you feel comfortable sharing, or you can make some stuff up. That's fine too.
Well, you would never know, I guess.
We would never know.
You would never know. So one of my favorite Sabbath stories, and just to show kind of the ways in which, how it looks can change. I mean, so many times when I go, it follows sort of a similar format, where, it's the scene unfolds and we're in the wilderness and there's a great fire and, people are dancing and feasting and there's all of this stuff going on. All of the classic elements are there. But one time it was more akin to sort of a wild hunt experience. And the wild hunt often gets talked about in relation to the Witches' Sabbath. And I think that they are related in a sense in terms of their historical development. And did this concept influence the development of the Witches' Sabbath? That I'm sort of skeptical of. But I would say that spiritually they're very related. And so instead of it being this, this sort of scene unfolding, it was more this like wild cavalcade where we're all sort of whipped up in the air and we're all sort of colliding together and fusing together, coming apart. And all of our, our spirits, our energies, our magic are mixing and mingling. And it's this tempest of madness, and then it all comes down. And you come back home, and even though for me it was kind of this like what just happened, like that's not at all what I was expecting. That was not sort of the norm, if there can be a norm. But it was really changing. I mean, it's one of those things where you come back, and I think that's true every time you go to the Sabbath or anytime you go to the other world in general. You come back and you're changed even just a little bit. So this was a very interesting experience that I definitely was not expecting.
I have had experiences like that as well. Lots of sort of making and unmaking, which I think is really interesting. And I'll tell you the secret behind the name of our show, because I consider the Witches' Sabbath as the crossroads. And I consider cosmologically the crossroads as that it's a place, across the veil in the middle world that's that central point of the axis mundi. You know, you've got the vertical and the horizontal coming together in that place. That's what I consider the crossroads. It's what I consider the witch's sabbath. And, you know, the cauldrons part is that pillar, that fire, that transformative, because there's been so many times at the witch's sabbath that I've had to get in the fire, or you get sort of through the dancing and through the movement, you get sort of pushed farther and farther inward towards the fire. And then eventually you're in the fire, and different types of things happen in there. I've been transported to other worlds. I've been, sometimes deity can sort of draw you to the fire and then sort of snatch you into it's like a private room. Like if you've been in a Zoom and you go to a breakout room, it's like that. And you're in sort of this private space communing with a particular deity or spirit, and then they pop you back into the Sabbath. Or you have literally unmaking, you know, where I've been sort of burnt into various particles and then fused back together in different ways. So I see those same functions over and over. But that's where the name for this show came from, Crossroads and Cauldrons. It's about that. It's about gathering at the witch's Sabbath. It's about creating transformative, hopefully, experiences coming together and being changed. I don't know where I was going with that, but I have had those sort of transformative experiences before. And I do, when you visit the Sabbath, and you know, we understand that it's different for everyone, but the common themes continue to play out. Like the fire is a central piece. I don't think I've ever heard of a story of someone's experience where they've been to the witch's Sabbath and there was not a central light, a pillar of light, fire, something like that. Even when they had never heard of the witch's Sabbath, and I recognize it because they're telling me what they saw, and I'm like, I know where you were, you know. But and then concentric rings of revelers, dancers, chanters, whatever it is. But there's like concentric rings, and sometimes people hang around the outer rings, and sometimes they merge into the more central rings, and then they pop out at the outside again. All different sorts of things happen. What are some of the common themes that are like, every time you've ever heard it, this is what you've heard? Because you may have some different, or maybe a more interesting question, what are some of the sort of totally different aspects that are not common that appear sometimes that you find interesting? Both of those questions.
Okay. Yeah, I mean the central fire is a big one, and I think the reason that comes up time and time again is it's this potent symbol of illumination, of that magic that is within all of us. It's that knowledge and that power that is granted to us, you know, that is sort of innate within us, but that is also granted to us through contact with spirit. So, you know, from my personal practice and sort of akin to the folklore would be, you know, it's the power that's bestowed to the witch by the devil. But of course, this can come from any spirit, really. So the fire, I mean, the circle, the concentric circles, the rune dance, I mean, really just the coven in general, this spiritual grouping. And again, it's a powerful symbol of community, of coming together, of rallying. For me, a lot of times the sort of location is a mountaintop, and that's a common Sabbath motif in terms of location. And I think really it's a liminal space. I mean, you're between the land and the sky. You're in this between space, this otherworldly space. So that often plays a role. Sometimes specific animals like snakes, again, powerful symbol of transformation. Snakes will come up, owls, sort of these, this sort of lonely woods as well. Like It's just the way that it's coming to my head to describe it, as this lonely forest. And when you were talking about like kind of going into that private room, for me, I often experience it as like, we're in this mountaintop and we're all doing the Sabbath thing, and then there's a point where you're called and you sort of go off into the woods. You go deeper down this trail, and it's at the end of this trail that you encounter whatever spirit is calling to you at that time, and you sort of have this private meeting, and then you go back. So trails, lots of like sort of bare trees, pine trees a lot. And these are also all symbols and motifs that have personal meaning to me. A lot of them are sort of rooted in my local landscape as well. So some of those things kind of crossing over, that imagery kind of coming together, if you will.
It's interesting that you specifically said pine trees, because I see pine trees. Of course, I live in Mississippi, and it's just the pine capital of the world. But evergreen trees is what the trees are always evergreens in my mind. I don't know that I've been to the Sabbath and like the leaves were falling, which is crazy because that's my favorite time of the year. I wonder if that's sort of part of the fact that it is this forever space. It is always happening. In your book, you talked about timing to visit the Sabbath and, going at midnight and all these things. But for me, I think the Sabbath itself can be accessed anytime. And I think that was what you illustrated by all the variety of times
Right.
that people said is the time to go, because it's always there. So yeah, if you go only once a week, it's always going to be there on that time. But, it's there other times as well. But it is this, it's sort of the crux of, that I don't know, I keep saying the same thing, that pathway between the world. It is like the liminal space, the expression of liminality. So it's always there. I know when we do Sabbats, Wheel of the Year in person, like celebrations with our human people, and our spirit people are also invited. But that's sort of an anchor point to get us there, to that place where we can have those transformative experiences. And there was a path. Hold on. It's coming back. It's coming back. And part of what in my tradition, I'm Temple of Witchcraft tradition. So part of my tradition is that, that we are in a place between space, between time, and all of the witches who have been, the first witch and the last witch, all of the witches who've been practicing throughout time and space are present. It's the same. We're going to that same initiatory point. What are your thoughts about that? Do you feel like the Sabbath changes and evolves and is different? Or do you feel like it's sort of that one singular time all happening at once? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's all of those things and none of those things at the same time. I mean, so much within witchcraft, and especially when it comes to the other world, it's such a paradox. There's, you look at it one way and you think you have it figured out, and then it instantly turns on its head, and you're like, what? But
that's my
one of the ways
about it.
It is one of the ways that I look at the Sabbath. And this is an idea that comes out of people like Austin Osman Spare and Kenneth Grant, who did a lot of writing about the Witches' Sabbath. But it's this idea of atavastic resurgence. It's this idea that there's these sort of pathways or these currents that you travel, and it's a backward sort of travel, that you go all the way back to this primordial sort of consciousness, this primordial spirit. And I think the Sabbath is one of those pathways. And so it's this crossroads, it's this nexus where, right, all of the things that have happened and all of the things that have yet to happen and all the things that are happening now, like it all comes together. It transcends time. It transcends space. So I definitely agree, and I like what you said about, all of the witches of the past and all of the witches that are yet to be. We're all coming together, and essentially, really, that's how I view the Sabbath. It is this crossroads of our folkloric heritage. All of these pieces of witchcraft, working with spirits, working with magic, all of these things come together. And so when we go there, we're engaging with this stream of history and folklore and magic. We're becoming part of this living spirit. So I think it does. It changes and evolves because we change and evolve, but it also has, all of the threads that have come before and all of the threads that, will come to be as well.
It's interesting in the book. Okay, I've got two questions, and I'm trying to merge them into one that makes sense all at the same time. My listeners are used to this for me, so don't worry. So some of the things that you talk about in your book, first of all, I want to emphasize that, when I'm reading this and I'm trying to picture in my mind what it would be like for, a Southern Baptist to pick up this book, they would be absolutely terrified. And I'm like, ooh, yes, let's go do this at the Sabbath, But, I'm a witch. What do you want? So there is some, you didn't shy away from the accusations that were more on the dark side of this. And I know that historical accounts are questionable because a lot of these confessions and stuff came under duress, and a lot of them were, here's what you need to say to make me stop this horrible things I'm doing to you. So I get that. And they were fed specific imageries, and that's why a lot of them are so synchronous with each other. However, I have experienced the Sabbath myself. And before I had read the history and the folklore, my practice started when I was very young. And how are they having such similar themes? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like there has to be a point where someone did have an experience, and perhaps they were absolutely frightened, and that's what prompted them to do the scapegoating and blame this on, a witch dragged me there, rather than trying to confront their fears about these different things and understand them. So do you feel like that's a possibility that someone or many someone's experience the Sabbath? Because it can happen, and often does happen, sort of spontaneously, and they just didn't know how to process, and in their social paradigm had no, it all seemed evil and horrible, so obviously they were carried away. But it's interesting because a lot of the things that are dark appearing, we understand them as moments for transformation. So like, especially things with like children and babies and stuff like that. A lot of my own healing work has been processing childhood traumas, and I've seen myself in vision as a child, as my child self, and there was one, I'm getting personal, hold please. But there was one very, very particular moment that happened spontaneously in a dream where my child self died and like became emaciated. But it was symbolic of that trauma, me processing that trauma and it withering away in my and how it affected me. So, but I see that, and I see that reflected in, you see these witches crowded around and in all the artwork and stuff like that, offering babies to the devil, and to me, I see that and I say, well, it looks to me like they're sacrificing their traumas and their whatever they've been holding on to, and they are giving that up and they're receiving empowerment in return. What are your thoughts about that? Because I just shared a whole bunch of thoughts. Look, I started a question and it didn't end up as a question, so you go.
Okay. I
Okay.
think that, I think anything is possible. I mean, one thing is like when we look at confessional material, there are things that are, you know, pretty obvious that they were inserted by interrogators. I mean, we can see this in some of the leading questioning that happens. Um, but there's also things too that the the person confessing, um, that they were inserting themselves. And this might be something that is based off of stories that they've already heard.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, people were already talking about magic and, and sort of witch figures. And so this would have been stories that people would have been somewhat at least familiar with. Um, there's also pieces too where we can see where, you know, like benign activities may have been um, sort of given this like demonic veneer in order to make them scary. So like different, maybe like everyday sort of like folk customs get rebranded as some sort of like uh, devilish ceremony. Um, so at the same time, is it possible that people during these time periods were also having sort of otherworldly experiences, even ones that they didn't necessarily intend to have, and then they're sharing that in these confessions, or they're being misconstrued in certain ways. I think it's possible. I mean, the thing is that we'll never know. Um,
That's the hardest part for me. I just want to
it is
know.
hard. We do want to know. Um, and so
I'm a
in some
Sagittarius.
ways,
It's my fatal flaw.
in some ways, I choose not to focus on that because we won't know. But what we do know is that this folklore has purpose and it has meaning to us today. And we know that when we tap into that folklore, we're tapping into something. I mean, we're obviously seeing it in our experiences. So it means something. Um, in terms of sort of the latter half, I mean, the ways that, right, we can look at things through different lenses. So, like, one way, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, is like acts of malefica or harmful magic at the Sabbath, or even outside of the Sabbath. When we look at witch trials, we can look at it through the lens of like, ooh, like that's bad, that's evil. They're hurting people, or they're hurting animals, or they're hurting crops. Um, but it looks very different when you look at it through the lens of social justice. When you look at kind of the political climate at the time, the ways that these people were suffering, or they were facing injustice, or they were just trying to survive. And so then when we look at that and we see things like magical acts where they're stealing crops, well, that's a way to feed yourself. Or
Mhm.
you look at them casting, sort of death spells on the local like lords, or even the offspring of those people. Those are ways of taking out your enemy, taking out the people that are oppressing you. Um, and so it becomes harder to sort of just look at in terms of this like, you know, good, bad, like cut and dry morality. Um, and also too, just looking at things through the lens of metaphor. So like your example with with some of the artwork, like I know in the book I talk about Goya's very, very famous piece, El Aquelarre. um, and in that painting, right, these witches are offering up infants to the devil. And we can look at that on a very surface level of like, okay, these are ladies who are sacrificing children. um, we could look at it, right, as like these people are giving up these pieces of themselves, or these traumas. Um, and I think that's also part of what is so wonderful about this, is there's so many different ways of looking at this. And it's not that any one way is necessarily more right than the other. It's just that each way unlocks something different for us.
I like where you're going with all of this. I'm just pondering things now. It's not necessarily engaging for podcast listeners, but I'm engaged, and that's important. Um, I have so much to think about. And I still want to know.
I know. Well, and part of it too, I mean, like when we talk about, I know for me, like when I talk about the Sabbath, like I want to be very like succinct and say all the things, but it also is such like as soon as I start to talk about it, it's like I just sort of drift off and like I go into this like deep head space and like my thoughts come out and I'm like, did that even make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I really like that. I'm gonna just kind of bring us back for a moment. I like that you have a lot of sort of practical applications in here. I would love to hear more about just sort of the theory of. I want to hear from I don't know. I'm getting into a crazy place now. I want to hear more about sort of the function and how that appears in. We talked about a lot of European societies, and that may be sort of language issues as well, plus writing. Like, I want to see, where does this appear in the Americas? How does it manifest in those places? How does it appear in Africa and in Asian countries and in other areas? Because I'm always looking for that thread that sort of permeates all cultures. I want to see the form of this otherworldly gathering space, that has these similar themes in other places besides just Europe, even though it's very, very interesting. I feel like I'm insulting your book. That's not what I'm doing. But I do like that I want you to keep diving on this because it is difficult to find. Like, I can't imagine what the research process was like for you, having to sort of dig through. Did you just dig through all these transcripts from the witch trials and all these different countries? Like, how did you do that?
With a lot of coffee, fueled by a lot of coffee and my need to know things. Yeah, it was a lot of sifting through different texts, tracking down different trial transcripts. It was a lot of notebooks filled with lots of scribbles. And yeah, the content of this book is really focused in on Europe and the early American colonies, because really that's where this concept is happening. In later folklore, so kind of moving forward after the witch trials, stories about witches' Sabbaths start to pop up in more popular folk tales, like just around the world. And I would also say too, I mean, in a lot of cultures across the world and throughout time, there are sort of similar concepts, similar imagery around, sort of like witch figures. And again, I use air quotes because there are cultural and language differences. And I'm really big on looking at those things and honoring those things because it's just too easy from our modern vantage point to look at different cultures, different regions, different time periods and go, oh, that's a witch. When those people would have had different language,
Yes.
those would have been, characters that are existing in their own cultural context. We see this a lot too, just with colonization that's happened, with the work of different anthropologists who have gone in to study different groups of people and
just sort of overlaid their own concepts.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's interesting to look at ways, like places like in Africa, right, where they maybe have concepts of sort of these like scary women. It's a lot of times it's very specifically women, although not always.
You're terrifying. I get it.
I think that's a good thing. And sort of like these beings that fly at night and do these, these different horrible things. Um, and so it's good. It's good to look at those things and see where maybe there was influence. Um, but also just to keep those things in context. Like I know in the American Southwest, some different kind of interesting concepts about witches and witches flying and meeting up come up. And of course, those are all things that I stumbled into after the book was well into being published, and I was like, damn it, like this would have been really interesting to include. So
And were
my hope
those,
is that.
sorry,
Oh, it's
um,
okay.
you were talking about in the American Southwest, was those have occurred after like Spanish colonization and
Yeah,
Catholicism?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so
Yep.
those are
So
the same sort of roots. Um,
right.
so interesting, but a lot of that too, you can sort of peel the layers of Catholicism off, and
Hmm.
find the traditions and folklore that is wearing that mask as well. But
Right.
I would like to hear that from someone who's kind of from those
Yes.
cultures,
Hmm.
dig into that. Like this book has really gotten me wanting to explore that. I'm just going to call it the crossroads, and how it's perceived and how it comes up and why it comes up in certain different ways to
Hmm.
different people. I guess I could go there and just ask some questions of the spirits there, see what they say.
Right.
But I loved this book so much. We've been talking for almost an hour and I don't want to stop. Let me just glance through my questions. Okay, so you talk a lot about different ways to achieve spirit flight, different ways to achieve trance states, what those are, and it's kind of a quick overview. Um, I'm assuming that you wrote this book for practitioners who have had some experience, um, in case something was missing from their training or their experience or their explorations, so they could get to the Sabbath if they have not been there before. So I'm glad that stuff is in there. Um, I hope that you continue to dig into this topic, because I would love to see what your research has has brought out for you. What Okay, I've got two last questions for you, and then I will
Okay.
release you into the wild. Um, for the first question, this is what I really like to ask all of our guests on the show. So, if there's a future project, and it doesn't have to be in the works, it could just be very amorphous right now. Like, is there a future project that you are very excited about that you want to see occur at some point in your life? What would that project be?
Well, I would say that one sort of future, maybe soon to be future, amorphous project, um, would be sort of a departure from the realm of nonfiction and sort of an exploration of folk tales and rhymes and um, sort of ways that some of this stuff can be expressed through storytelling, um, and sort of fun rhyming structure. I think, one of my favorite things to do is to tell stories and to create these sort of fantastical fudgings of the truth, if you will. And um, I also really love rhymes. I love nursery rhymes. I think that they are really cool when you look at them through the lens of being spells. And so I think it would be super cool to put something out there that is within that realm.
I would personally love to see that. And I'll tell you a little secret. I have seen, sort of on the path of just I don't know, people's practices as they grow. They start off very like tied into the folklore, tied into the mythology. This is so fascinating. And then they switch gears into how can I put this together academically? How can I put this together logically? And then when they develop a strong practice, it takes them right back to the storytelling and the rhyme and the poetry of words, because you get to a point where what you're trying to express cannot be put in a box. It can't be categorized. It can't be logically explained in any sort of way. And you begin to express that outwardly more through poetry and through art. And I think that's fucking beautiful. And I'm seeing other authors start to do that too. Like, I'm going to release a book that's going to be totally different from all of my other books, because this is where my spirit is taking me. You know, I'm going to express it through rhyme and through story. And I want to see so much more of that, because I think that we as a culture, as an culture, I think we're missing that. I think we got so focused on, we got to prove this is real, you know, to the outside world, that we've forgotten our own threads of story. And you see that with like, you see that at the ends of, like, even going back to some of the early founders and things of different traditions, at the end, they become more, you know, more poetic. That's where their expressions are. So I think that's beautiful. And I'm not saying that's like the end of your practice. No, but please do that. I want to see more. I want to see more of that. Because I think we connect with words in that way, in a different way. It accesses a different part of our psyche, and our spirit, you know, which, that's what I mean when I say psyche. Anyway, that's beautiful. Do it. I encourage you. I'm going to buy it. All my listeners are going to buy it. Go ahead and do it. So, and then my last question is, where can we find you? Where are you in the world?
Yeah, I mean, the primary place that you can find me is on Instagram, at Keldon Mercury. You can also find me under Keldon Mercury on YouTube. Those are going to be the two primary places. I am somebody who has more and more every day pulled away from social media. So how long you'll be able to find me in those places is kind of up in the air. But otherwise, you can find me at the Sabbath.
I like that answer. No, I'm with you on the social media thing. I'm terribly not good at social media. Our podcast is like, I like to talk to people and educate people if I can and share experiences, but I'm terrible with like marketing. I'm not going to be like, hey, listen to our show. I'm just bad at that. I mean,
Me too.
But I'm terrible at it. So they know, they're used to that. Thank you. Thank you so much. I've so enjoyed talking to you. I do hope you'll come back and let us know when you get that book written, because I want to read it. And all of Keldon's links will be in our show notes. We've got a link to his Instagram and his Pathos blog as well, if you want to go read some of that. And yeah, buy this book, you guys. Buy this book, The Witch's Sabbath. I'm going to show the book. It's beautiful. I don't know if you can see it or if it's shining. The Witch's Sabbath, an exploration of history, folklore, and modern practice. Thank you so much for being on the show. And
thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yay, anytime. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we will catch you on the next episode. If you have not already subscribed, do it, because this is your last chance. No, I don't know. Subscribe. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and blessed be. Thank you all so much for listening, and don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe through your favorite podcast provider. It helps us get our podcast in front of more listeners just like you. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can leave us a voicemail by clicking the link in the description of this episode, and you can always find us on Facebook and Instagram by searching for Crossroads and Cauldrons Podcast.